For years, Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar were presented as the picture of a traditional Christian marriage. Disciplined, structured, morally certain. Whether audiences agreed with their beliefs or not, there was always this sense that the Duggars believed they had the formula figured out. Their interviews, books, seminars, and television appearances weren't treated like casual family conversations. They were presented almost like examples people were supposed to learn from. How husbands should lead, how wives should respond, how families should function. And for a long time, millions of viewers accepted that image because it was repeated constantly through television specials, interviews, speaking events, and their connection to conservative Christian culture. But recently, some viewers started revisiting old Duggar seminar footage and hearing it very differently. Not because of one dramatic confession, not because some hidden document suddenly appeared online, but because of the actual language Jim Bob and Michelle use throughout the discussion, the examples they choose, the repeated references to temptation, guilt, confession, and struggles. And the more people re-watch the clips now, the more uncomfortable the entire conversation begins to feel, especially with the benefit of hindsight. Because once audiences already know the larger controversies surrounding the Duggar family, even ordinary moments inside the seminar begin sounding different than they once did. What makes the footage unsettling isn't one explosive revelation, it's the slow realization that the conversation feels far less polished than the public image the family spent years building. Underneath the marriage advice and spiritual language, there's tension running through almost every major topic, and viewers picked up on it immediately once they started listening more carefully. The seminar itself was originally framed as relationship advice, communication, forgiveness, temptation, marriage struggles, the kinds of topics the Duggar world and IBLP culture had discussed publicly for decades. And at first, the conversation sounds fairly predictable. Michelle tells emotional stories. Jim Bob talks about spiritual leadership. The tone feels calm and familiar. But early in the discussion, Michelle shares a story from before their marriage that immediately changes the atmosphere. She explains that a friend once told her a wife should always remain available for her husband because she's the only person who can meet certain emotional and physical needs in his life. And the way Michelle tells the story matters. She isn't joking. She isn't presenting it casually. She describes it almost like foundational marriage wisdom, the kind of advice that shaped how she understood her role as a wife from the very beginning. Now, on its own, some viewers may simply hear that as traditional conservative relationship advice, but others heard something deeper underneath it. Because the message isn't really framed around mutual connection or emotional partnership, it's framed around responsibility. More specifically, responsibility for preventing temptation. And once that idea enters the discussion, it quietly becomes the foundation for almost everything that follows afterward. Because throughout the seminar, there's this recurring implication that if a husband struggles spiritually or sexually, the wife may somehow share part of the responsibility for protecting him from that outcome. And that's where many viewers started feeling uneasy. Not because the seminar suddenly becomes openly scandalous, but because the emotional dynamic underneath it slowly starts revealing itself piece by piece. As the discussion continues, Jim Bob eventually shifts toward talking about temptation more directly. Television, pornography, secret sin, online content. At first, the examples sound broad and generalized, the kind of warnings many conservative Christian speakers have made for years. But then the language starts becoming unusually personal. At one point, Jim Bob talks about having satellite television years earlier and describes certain channels as a battle for my soul. Again, by itself, that statement probably wouldn't shock most people. But what unsettled viewers was the intensity of the framing. Not just temptation, but the repeated suggestion that men are constantly on the edge of losing control. And throughout the seminar, there's this pattern where responsibility subtly shifts outward, toward media, toward temptation itself, toward women, rather than focusing primarily on personal accountability. And then comes the moment many viewers now point to as one of the first major turning points in the seminar. Jim Bob describes driving through town and seeing a woman walking to her mailbox in a bikini. That's the example he chooses, a woman walking outside in a swimsuit. And according to Jim Bob, he later went home and confessed this moment to Michelle. That story completely changes the emotional atmosphere of the seminar for many viewers, because the situation itself sounds incredibly ordinary. Nothing inappropriate actually happened. But within the framework Jim Bob describes, even briefly noticing another person becomes spiritually loaded, almost treated like moral failure. And once that uncertainty enters the conversation, the entire seminar starts feeling different, because viewers begin realizing the discussion may not just be about marriage advice anymore. It starts sounding like something far more personal. What makes that moment even more uncomfortable is Michelle's reaction to it. She doesn't push back against the framing. She doesn't say the situation sounds harmless or exaggerated. Instead, she reinforces the idea that confession and transparency are essential parts of marriage. And throughout the seminar, that emotional pattern keeps repeating itself. The husband struggles. The husband confesses. The wife absorbs the emotional impact. The wife forgives. Again and again, the emotional burden seems to fall in the same direction. And that's where many viewers began connecting the seminar to the broader culture surrounding IBLP itself, because critics of the organization have spent years describing a system where women were often expected to help regulate male temptation while simultaneously carrying the emotional responsibility for preserving the relationship. That context matters here, especially because Jim Bob repeatedly expands the conversation beyond himself. He starts talking about pastors, Christian fathers, men secretly struggling, men hiding things from their wives, men falling into online temptation. And then the seminar suddenly takes another strange turn: Craigslist. Out of nowhere, Jim Bob starts referencing websites where people secretly meet others for sexual encounters, describing it as a growing issue even inside Christian circles. And viewers immediately focused on that section because it feels oddly specific compared to the rest of the discussion. Now, to be completely clear, there's no public evidence proving Jim Bob himself used Craigslist that way. That's not what made people uncomfortable. The discomfort came from the framing, the specificity, the repeated movement between speaking generally and sounding strangely personal at the same time. And the audience is left trying to figure out where exactly the line between advice and confession actually is. That ambiguity becomes the thing many viewers can't stop focusing on, because the seminar constantly exists in this uncomfortable middle ground, where audiences can't fully tell whether Jim Bob is speaking hypothetically or indirectly revealing personal struggles through generalized language. And honestly, that uncertainty may be exactly why these clips continue circulating online years later. People aren't reacting to one definitive revelation. They're reacting to the atmosphere of the discussion itself, the anxiety underneath it, the fear, the guilt, the repeated sense that temptation is always one step away from destabilizing the family structure they spent years publicly promoting. And when viewers revisit the footage today, they're no longer watching it in isolation. They're watching it through the lens of everything the Duggar family later became associated with publicly. That changes the emotional context of the entire seminar, because suddenly the discussion stops sounding like polished relationship advice and starts feeling more like insight into the emotional logic of the system itself. A system where image mattered deeply, where confession was encouraged, where forgiveness was expected, and where women often appeared responsible for helping men manage themselves emotionally and spiritually. That doesn't automatically mean every interpretation viewers make is correct, and it's important not to turn speculation into certainty. But the discomfort surrounding this footage is understandable, because even without dramatic editing or sensational claims, the seminar creates an atmosphere many viewers now find difficult to ignore once they notice it. Especially when the people speaking were once presented as experts on morality, marriage, and family stability. And maybe that's the real reason viewers keep coming back to these clips now, not because they prove one shocking secret, but because they unintentionally reveal how different the Duggar image feels once the performance starts slipping. Maybe that's why these clips continue resurfacing years later, not because of one explosive revelation, but because the entire conversation feels different once people start listening more carefully to what's actually being said. Maybe that's why these clips continue resurfacing years later, not because of one explosive revelation, but because the entire conversation feels different once people start listening more carefully to what's actually being said. I want to hear your perspective, though. Do you think viewers are reading too much into these seminar clips? Or do you think the language and relationship dynamics genuinely feel uncomfortable in hindsight? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you enjoy documentary-style deep dives and breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload.